In this video, I will teach you how to think in endgames and how to handle them. So let's take a look at this position right here. So this is actually a position that I played against a 2000 rated player, and this is the material count. Both sides have rooks and both sides have 4 pawns each. However, I was actually able to beat my opponent in this endgame. Now you might ask, okay, how? Because it's equal material completely. There's barely any imbalance. Actually, the only imbalance is in the structure, and that imbalance is that black has F and G pawns and white has G and H pawns. However, this is actually enough to create some winning chances in this position. It's not objectively winning, and a lot of end games that you're going to be playing against your opponents are not going to be objectively winning. However, you can still push them for a win, and you can still try to ask practical questions from your opponents and use these small details in your favor. And now I'm going to explain how I was able to win this position. So the move that I played in this position was rook to c3. Opponent is just shuffling. I go b4 and I go b5, and opponent went king f6, and here the position all of a sudden becomes completely winning, and that is because I can play this move rook to c6, and after a move like a king e5, this is what was played in the game, captures, after h4, I am able to create an outside passed pawn. So I'm able to win this game because my pawn, my passed pawn, is further away than my opponent's passed pawn. So this is a basic decoy concept. And from here, this did not actually happen in the game. The opponent resigned, but this is how this position is winning, for example. So going back, how was I able to recognize that there is some practical value in a position like this? And this is where schematic thinking comes into the play. A lot of players in the past used this method. For example, Capablanca used to use this, Fischer used to use it as well. And what this method is all about is you have to envision the final point of the position, and you have to envision what could happen in this position. So from here, this was the beginning of this position right here, of this endgame. This is what I was able to envision. This was my thought process. This position right here, king and pawn endgame. So what I realized was that if I traded off the rooks, and if I went h4 and actually got this pawn trade as well on h4, this would be a winning endgame for the white pieces. So instead of offering a draw, I actually decided to play this position out, and it turned out very well. I was able to win this game. Now, why is schematic thinking so effective, especially in the endgame? That is because when you're in the endgame phase of the game, what's going on is that you have too many options. So for example, with the rook, you have so many different options. You cannot possibly brute force calculate every single option, and you cannot brute force figure out what's going on in the position. You have to look at imbalances, and you have to envision how you can possibly create a breakthrough or possibly create a winning chance for yourself. And this is how you think in endgames. You don't try to calculation comes second. You first have to envision where you want your pieces to go, what the structure is like, where you can create your winning chances. And of course, this requires some studying as well. For example, if you don't know that h4 creates what's called an outside passed pawn, let me go here. Of course, opponent does not have to take here, but let's say he does hypothetically, and we get this position. You have to know why this position, why these two pawns are advantageous for the white pieces. It's because this pawn is further outside, so the black king has to travel a longer distance to get back into the game. In this case, because the rooks are still on the board, the position is still a draw. So if you want to get better at endgames, you have to use this method of schematic thinking, and of course you have to study endgames as well, because once you study these endgames, you're going to be able to come up with these ideas instantaneously. It's not even going to be a challenge at that point. So you have to study your endgames like you study your openings. Now, I wish somebody had an endgame series that you could watch on YouTube and not get bored and also learn a lot of different things. I wonder who's got that. I'm just saying. Just saying. But now let's move on to what you should be focusing on in endgames. Okay, now let's take a look at this position, for example. And as you can see, the material is once again equal in this endgame. So both sides have 5 pawns, but there is an imbalance of 2-on-1 on the queen side and 4-on-3 on the king side, 4-on-3 for black. Both sides have rooks, and it is white to move here, and the position is slightly advantageous for the white pieces. Now you might ask, how can that be? Because both sides have equal amounts of pawns, and it's a rook endgame. So in the earlier position, it was a complete draw, but in this case, it's still equal amount of pawns, and the position is slightly favorable for the white side. And that is because of the pawn structure. And this is the point that I'm trying to make in this segment. If you want to win your endgames, you should always focus on the pawn structure and specifically where you can create passed pawns. That is what you should be focusing on in any endgame. Pawns matter the most, and it's not the quantity of pawns, because in this case the quantity of pawns is the same. It is also the quality of pawns. This B pawn is of a higher quality than this E pawn right here, because this E pawn is the equivalent of white's B pawn in this case, right? Because white has an extra B pawn, black has an extra E pawn, but this pawn is of a much higher quality. And let me show you why this is so strong, why this pawn is so strong. You can play B5 in this position, just advancing, and then you can go A4, and then let's say both sides bring their kings. We know that in the end game, you need to bring your king, you need to activate your king. So let's say G5, and both sides just play some moves out, and both sides just try to advance. Well, white is successfully advancing, while black is sort of frozen in this case. And now a move like rook to B7 is played, and now rook to B5. And this is another very important principle in endgames. If you have a passed pawn, you want to put your rook behind it if you want to advance it, and if you're the side that is defending, you want your rook behind it. So in this case, an optimal placement for this rook that's on B7, the black rook, would be actually where the white rook is. So if these rooks switched places, that would be fantastic for the black pieces, because it would be harder to advance this pawn. But because the rook is behind the passed pawn in this case, that's what makes this endgame winning for the white pieces. So let's say king to d7, king d4, king c6, the rook goes back, and let's say rook gives a check. You cannot take the pawn on b6, even though this might look like a free pawn. You just go into a losing king and pawn endgame. This is just lost. You go here, you advance the pawn, and you win. So let's say black gives this check, rook d7. It doesn't matter. We go king to e5. We're gonna devour all of these pawns. Even if the black king blocks the pawn, this is still a winning position. This is a very professional move, a rook b2, protecting the second rank before you take all of the pawns over here. And this position is completely winning for the white pieces. Now I want to go back to the beginning position, and right before we played b5. What I want you to notice is that I played b5 here. This is one of the top computer moves, but I did not play this move rook to c7. If we play this move rook to c7, this is actually slightly inaccurate. It's still slightly better for white, but it is a little bit inaccurate, and that is because if you just start chasing this pawn, black has this very nice move a5, sacrificing the pawn. If you push the pawn, there's rook to d3, and this is of course very uncomfortable. You're gonna lose the pawn. Now this is a complete draw. But going back, if you take this pawn, this is a draw anyways because of rook d3 once again, rook d4 once again, and now you see black gets this placement of the rook on a4. And because black gets his rook behind the passed pawn, it's harder to push it, therefore this position is a draw. In this position, let me just go back to the position that I showed you earlier, no, later than this. we had our rook, our white rook, escorting the pawn. So this rook placement matters tremendously in these endgames. But you have to envision all of that from all the way back here. You have to envision that you have 2-on-1 on this side. You have to realize that, and then you have to envision the fact that at some point your rook is going to end up behind a potential passed pawn, and then this rook right here or the king will be forced to forever be passive because of the threat of advancing this pawn, which will give this king the time to get in and devour all of these pawns. And that's exactly what happens in this variation. The rook is distracted by this pawn, so is the king, and the king tries something, but our king gets in, and now we're devouring all of these pawns. So we use this pawn as a decoy, even in a rook endgame. Now I'm going to show you a game played between Svetozar Gligoric with the white pieces. I really hope I'm pronouncing that name correctly. I apologize if I'm not. And Bobby Fischer with black. And once again, Bobby Fischer uses this method of schematic thinking very, very well, and he realizes the concept of passed pawns and why quality of passed pawns matters more than quantity. So here in this position, he plays the only move that gives black a slight advantage here, and that is c4, because after b takes c4, his rook gets in on the second rank, and after a move like knight to f1, here he plays an absolutely incredible move, rook takes h5, sacrificing his rook, however winning the pawn in the process, and he's gonna get this knight back with rook to f2, and then rook takes f1. So Bobby Fischer sacrifices a rook for a knight and a pawn, but more than that, what matters here is that these two pawns are going to be completely lost, and you cannot defend them with the white pieces. So let's say after rook to h8, that's what happened in the game, rook h8, king takes e4, rook to a3, and then rook to g1 check, king to h2, and then rook goes all the way to c1. And here, after a couple of moves, actually, this is very, very professional by Bobby Fischer. This is a very nice sequence of moves by him. He plays rook c2 first, just to force the king back or forward, which is also uncomfortable because this king is under some severe mate threats here if you go forward. And if you go back, you're just a little bit passive. So he delays capturing this because the pawn is not going anywhere, and he plays another fantastic move. This is not necessarily related to the topic of this video, but he plays this move c5, which is another incredible move, because if you just capture it right away, there is c5 by the white pieces. And even though this position is still objectively winning, there is a lot more counterplay in this position with moves like rook to b8, and it's going to be just a little bit harder to advance. Like, for example, you push this pawn, the rook goes over here, and you don't really have a good way of crossing the fourth rank. It's a little bit uncomfortable, but with a move like c5, you're able to hold this bishop here. You're able to reduce the activity of this rook, because if this pawn is pushed, the activity of the rook improves dramatically, because now the rook was cutting off the fourth rank. This is a very, very nice rook on a4, but after c5, it is not a very nice rook. It's a very passive rook instead. So Bobby Fischer played a very nice sequence of moves, but what Bobby Fischer was able to visualize from a couple moves ago was that he would win both of these pawns, and then he would be left with these two connected passed pawns. And as I said earlier, you have to focus on passed pawns if you want to win endgames. That's what makes or breaks your position in an endgame. A single passed pawn, in this case, two passed pawns, and then Bobby Fischer was able to win this game a couple of moves later. I'm not going to go into too much detail here because it's not really the topic of the video, but he went on to win this game in a very nice fashion, and in this position, Gligoric resigned the game. There is one more endgame that I want to show you, and in this case, William Winter is playing with the white pieces against the former world champion, Jose Raul Capablanca. And in this position, Capablanca is slightly better, and let's see how he handles this endgame and what ideas he's able to come up with. So here he plays b5, rook to a1, and now in this position, he plays this move c4. That's actually funny. This is 2 moves in a row where a c4 sort of a pawn sacrifice was used to gain activity for the rook. In the Bobby Fischer case, that was exactly the same. He used the exact same pawn break. He used c4 all the way back here. So that's very, very funny how this happened exactly like in this game as well. But more importantly, with c4, you are able to activate your bishop with the black pieces. So this bishop is very, very nice now after c4 because it's going to get a lot of scope, and after all of these pawns are traded off, which is actually what happened in the game. Let me just go a couple of moves ahead. Something like this happened where black was left with this passed pawn, and this bishop is very nice because once you advance this pawn, the bishop is going to be able to support that pawn. Even though it might look a little bit passive on d6, it's actually not passive at all. But on the other hand, white's counterpart on g3 is completely dead. And this is what Capablanca was able to visualize from far away through schematic thinking. Let me go to this configuration right here. I just removed all the pieces. He was able to notice that this bishop can't really go anywhere. So let's say this bishop can't go to h4, it can't go to f4. If it goes to h2, it can't go anywhere either, because if you go to g1, where are you going? So this bishop right here is completely walled in. So he was able to construct this idea of just simply keeping this bishop here, not touching this side of the board at all. And sometimes that's how you have to view the position, going all the way back. You don't have to look at the board in its entirety. You can look at specific parts. You can realize that, okay, this part of the board is completely shut down. Nothing is going on here. So let me focus on this part where I can actually improve my pieces, because this bishop just simply cannot improve. It cannot do anything. But this bishop, on the other hand, can after c4. And this concept might seem a little too advanced, but I still think that if you start to notice these things early on, if you're able to pick up on these details early on, that knowledge is going to stick more in the long run.